Melophobia. In the heart of a suburban city, in the corner of a quiet, tree-lined street, there sat an old brick house. This house, unlike its modern neighbors, seemed to belong to a different era, much like its young inhabitant, Jeremy. Jeremy was an ordinary 11-year-old boy, but his fascination with the past was anything but ordinary. Jeremy's room was on the second floor of the house. Even the handrail whispered of a smoky history. It was a mixture of his youthful present and the ancient history he so adored. A model of the Flying Scotsman train sat atop his dresser, meticulously painted with its elegant green coat and black trim. It was not a toy, but a precise replica of the renowned British steam locomotive from the early 20th century. Beside it lay an assortment of fossils and aged coins, each carefully labeled and neatly arranged. Placed next to his prized arrowhead collection and wood-carved animals. The room's walls were lined with shelves, weighed down by stacks of yellowed newspapers and dusty books. One shelf held an elaborate ship in a bottle that his grandmother had given him, a painstakingly detailed model of the HMS Victory. Another shelf was dedicated to a collection of antique photographs, their subjects dressed in fashions of eras long past. Jeremy's grandmother had been his partner in these historical explorations. She had been a curator at the city's history museum, and it was her stories of the past and her treasures that sparked his love for history. They used to spend hours together, poring over objects that bore the marks of another time, as she captivated him with tales of their origins. But she was gone now, and these objects, these antiquities, were his connection to her, a bridge that linked him to the grandmother he missed with all his 11-year-old heart. His friends, George and Lily, often joined him in his room after school, and although they didn't share his passion for history, they appreciated his enthusiasm. By now they knew all too well they weren't toys, something that took learning the hard way. George was an avid soccer player, his dreams dominated by the Premier League and World Cup glory. Lily, on the other hand, was a budding artist, her sketchpad filled with drawings of the world as she saw it. One afternoon, the trio sat huddled around an old record player Jeremy had recently acquired. They watched as he gently set a vinyl record onto the turntable, carefully lowered the needle, and released the sounds of Elvis Presley into the room. The crackling music filled the air, mingling with the laughter and chatter of the children. Lily sat cross-legged on Jeremy's bedroom floor, her sketchpad open on her lap, while George sprawled on the old rug, his fingers tap-tap-tapping a rhythm against an antique tin box. Jeremy was on his bed, propped up against a pile of pillows, absent-mindedly playing with an old pocket watch. "So, your birthday's coming up," Lily said, her eyes not leaving her sketchpad. "Have any ideas what you'll get?" Jeremy's eyes lit up, a hopeful gleam reflecting off his glasses. "I hope it's something super old, something I can add to this," he said, gesturing to the odd collection. "You know, I'll be 12. That's pretty grown up." George snorted, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, sure. Grown up enough to get an antique gun or a Native American longbow, right?" Jeremy's face reddened slightly, but he nodded with a shit-eating grin. "Exactly. Just think about it. With a bow, I could practice archery, or with an old gun, I could learn about its history, its mechanism. I hope Dad will be home long enough to teach me though. He works a lot, I wish he didn't." Lily looked up from her sketchpad and grinned. "I think you're more likely to get another old painting," she said. "Maybe one that'll gather dust behind your bed along with the others." George laughed, his tapping on the tin box growing louder. "All I care about is that your party has pizza, Jeremy. And not that fancy stuff, but a good, greasy pizza with loads of cheese." Jeremy chuckled, a warm, welcoming sound echoing off the antique-filled room. "Don't worry, George. I'll make sure they don't forget your cheese-drenched pizza." The morning sun peeked through the blinds, stripes of golden light shined across Jeremy's room. It was a special day, his birthday, and the anticipation had kept him awake for most of the night. As he sat through each class, he could hardly focus on the lessons. His mind was abuzz with excitement, eagerly awaiting the end of the school day. In English class, he did like he did most days. He scribbles little desires and pokes fun at people with his friend Zach. "Happy birthday by the way," Zach said. "I can't wait till you get out of here either. My mom said she's got to take me to pick out your gift today. I know exactly what I'm going to get you." Jeremy's responses were almost in autopilot. His gaze was fixed on the clock above the teacher's desk. Periods passed like molasses in winter, slow and agonizing, but finally, the school bell rang, marking the end of the day. Jeremy bolted out of his seat, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest as he rushed to the car. His father, usually late due to work, had come early today, a twinkle in his eyes and a grin on his face as he greeted his son. "Happy birthday, champ," he exclaimed, ruffling Jeremy's hair affectionately. "How was school? Did you learn anything valuable today?" he asked, already knowing the response. "Come on, Dad, you know I didn't learn anything today. All I can focus on was getting home." "What did you guys get me?" "Well, I can't just tell you that, could I? Guess you're just going to have to wait and see when you get home." Their drive was filled with laughter and the aroma of Jeremy's favorite treat, elephant ears. His father had swung by their favorite bakery on the way, the one that made them just the way Jeremy loved, crisp, sugary, and piping hot. When they pulled up at home, Jeremy was met with a sight that made his heart leap. Colorful streamers hung from the trees, balloons bobbed in the breeze, and his friends Lily and George were already there, their faces split into wide grins. The yard was transformed into a carnival of joy, the perfect setting for an unforgettable birthday. As the day slipped into evening, the party reached its crescendo. Laughter echoed through the yard, the sounds of merriment punctuated by the occasional pop of a balloon. When the cake had been eaten and the games played, it was time for the most anticipated part of the day, the gifts. Jeremy's mind raced as he looked at the pile of presents. He had spent countless hours scouring thrift stores for oddities and antiques, and he wondered if his parents had picked up on his hints. His fingers itched to tear at the wrapping paper, to uncover the treasures hidden beneath. Finally, it was time for the gift from his parents. It was a small box, elegantly wrapped in gold paper. His heart pounded in his chest as he gently unwrapped it, revealing an old 20th century music box. His breath hitched as he took it in, the intricate carvings, the beautifully aged wood. He wound it up and a soft, haunting melody filled the air. It was the perfect end to the perfect day. Nighttime, after the laughter had died down and the guests had retreated into the darkness of the night, he was left alone in the quiet of his room. The scent of the vanilla birthday cake still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint trace of cologne from Uncle Max's enthusiastic hugs. The room was awash with the soft glow of the solitary lamp on his desk, giving him just enough illumination for his examinations. His family had retired to their respective rooms, leaving him to his thoughts and his new possession. All the other gifts he received, that they were inconsequential, this one on the other hand enveloped him. His eyes were drawn to the delicate box that sat on his desk. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, the polished mahogany wood gleaming in the soft light, the intricate carvings of roses and vines weaving a tale of a time long past. A small brass crank jutted out from its side, waiting to breathe life into the tiny dancer who stood poised inside. With a delicate touch, he began to explore the box. His fingers traced the smooth edges, danced over the detailed carvings, and finally rested on the crank. As he turned it, the box came alive. The soft, eerie melody filled the room, the notes drifting into the silent air. With each turn of the crank, the little dancing woman spun gracefully, her tiny painted eyes seeming to stare right into his soul. It was then that he saw it. A shadow flickered in the corner of his eye. A chill ran down his spine, and he felt an uncanny sensation of something passing behind him. He swiftly turned, his heart pounding against his chest, but found nothing. The room was as it was, still and silent, save for the ghostly music that continued to play. He shook off the unsettled feeling, attributing it to the late hour and the lullaby of the music box. Just as he was about to return to the examination of his gift, a loud crash echoed through the room. His heart leapt to his throat as he saw the antique clock his Uncle Max had given him lying shattered on the floor. The shock sent jolts of adrenaline through him. The eerie music from the box was now drowned by the ringing in his ears. He stood there for a moment, staring at the broken clock, his mind racing. Then, with a sigh, he moved away from his desk, deciding to leave the cleanup for the morning. He quickly wound down the music box, the room falling into a deafening silence as the last note faded away. He climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. He tried to ignore the strange occurrences, attributing them to his tired mind playing tricks on him. He forced his eyes shut, trying to drown out the residual fear with thoughts of the day's joy. Yet, as sleep began to claim him, the eerie melody of the music box echoed in his mind, the shadows in his room seeming to dance along. Jeremy sat in his third period class, the hum of voices and the scratch of pencils against paper fading into a dull background noise. The usual vibes of a Friday were ever present. The charged air in the classroom bristled with anticipation as the students eagerly watched the clock, waiting for the hands to strike the hour signaling their weekend freedom. But the excitement that usually sparked Jeremy's spirit was absent that day. His mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the peculiar events of the previous night. The strangeness that had enveloped his room after his birthday celebration left him with a sense of unease that clung to him like a shadow, refusing to be shaken off. His thoughts kept returning to the music box, that small, ornate object that had been the source of his perplexity. Even more so now than ever. As the hours passed, the world outside continued its daily routine, oblivious to Jeremy's internal turmoil. The bell finally rang, its shrill sound cutting through his thoughts. He shambled out of class, his steps slow and his gaze distant. "Hey, Jeremy!" George's voice pulled him from his reverie. George and Lily were waiting for him, their faces lighting up with their usual cheerful grins. But their smiles faltered when they saw him, their brows furrowing with concern. "Hey, man, you okay?" George asked, slapping him lightly on the back. Lily's eyes searched his face, her expression mirroring George's worry. "Jeremy, you seem off today. What's wrong?" Lily's voice was soft, filled with genuine concern. The concern of a friend. Jeremy shrugged, forcing a smile onto his face. He didn't want to worry them with his baseless concerns, his unfounded fears. "Nothing's wrong. Just tired, I guess," he lied, managing to keep his voice steady. But as he walked away, leaving his friends behind, the melody of the music box echoed in his mind. Jeremy walked into his room, its familiar confines seeming somehow different after recent occurrences. The sun cast long shadows on the floor, cloaking the room in an eerie half-light. He tossed his backpack onto his bed, and placed himself in his usual spot. There it was, sitting innocently on his desk, the music box. It was a small, unassuming object, but it held a mystery that had consumed his thoughts for the better part of the day. His hand approached it slowly, as though it were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. Jeremy reached out and picked up the box, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface. He examined it closely, turning it over in his hands. The intricate carvings and embellishments that adorned its exterior seemed to shimmer in the fading light, captivating him once more. Steeling his nerves, he started to wind the key on its side. The metallic click and whir of the mechanism sounded loud in the silence of his room, each turn of the key building up the tension. With one last turn, he stopped, the box now fully wound. He held his breath, his heart thumping against his rib cage, a silent drum of his anticipation. For a moment, he hesitated, the box silent in his hands. Then, with a mixture of fear and excitement, he released the latch. As the notes hung in the air, Jeremy sat there, the music box in his hands, his eyes reflecting the strange dance of fear and fascination that played within him. As the melody slowly faded, he was left with a sense of profound wonder and a myriad of questions that seemed to have no answers. This time he heard whispers, and the closer he listened the more he came to the conclusion. The voices were coming from inside the box. He looked inside of it curiously. "Yeah, no." He set the music box down and stood up. "This is not happening." He left his room to venture downstairs and find the note on the refrigerator that his mom left him. "Dinner's in the fridge, I'll be back at 6 o'clock. Please do not burn the house down." Scrawled in his mother's neat handwriting, he opened the fridge door. "Casserole, eh?" He rolled his eyes and shut it. His attempts at distracting himself from the weirdness by watching TV and scanning the stations brought him no relief. He scanned station by station until he finally found something to properly distract. Antiques Roadshow, a program he and his grandmother adored. He woke up still sitting in front of the TV, still a little groggy with a stiff neck. He was surprised to hear keys in the door. His father stepped in, shaking the rain from his jacket and stamping his feet on the mat. "Where is your mother?" He checked his watch and continued. "She should have been home hours ago. Did she say anything?" Jeremy looked just as puzzled. "No, well, she left a note on the fridge." His father didn't look too worried. Sometimes, Tabby stayed late for overtime, but usually those nights came with a warning. He began calling various places, starting with her work and ending with her friends. The evening rain was coming down hard, casting a gloomy, almost spectral pallor over the cityscape. Jeremy and his father, both dressed in heavy, waterproof raincoats, sat inside their car, navigating the labyrinthine city streets with a growing sense of dread. The car's headlights sliced through the darkness. It was unlike her. Jeremy thought. She was usually meticulous about keeping them informed of her whereabouts, but tonight, she was nowhere to be found, and every unanswered phone call twisted their stomachs into tighter knots. As they drove, Jeremy couldn't shake the haunting melody of the music box from his mind. Its tune, usually a soothing lullaby that lulled him to sleep, was now a terrifying siren song that seemed to echo the dread gnawing at the edges of his mind. He couldn't break his sight away from his dad's white knuckles gripping the steering wheel. His tense gaze and furrowed brow gave Jeremy a sinking feeling in his stomach. His father was one of the most calm and collected people he knew. They passed a homeless man pushing a wheelchair laden with what appeared to be his entire life. The sight of him, hunched over against the onslaught of rain, reminded them of their own struggles. At the next red light, Jeremy's eyes landed on another figure, a man standing in the rain with his hood up. His face was obscured, hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. Jeremy squinted, trying to discern any features, but as the traffic light cycled to green and his father pressed on the gas pedal, the man looked up. His face seemed to melt away in the rain, a horrifying sight that made Jeremy quickly divert his eyes. Forcing his attention back on the road ahead, he tried to sync his racing heart with the rhythmic swish-swish of the windshield wipers. But the image remained imprinted on his mind, adding another layer of anxiety to their already tense nighttime expedition. Jeremy's nervous heart raced, and he wondered if it was ever going to slow back to normal. The rain pelted the window and thunder rolled in the distance. He read the face of every car they passed, meticulously noting every car on the road. Finally, after an hour of aimlessly driving through the city, they reached the industrial district. An isolated part of the city, it was a place of abandoned factories and warehouses, a ghost town of rusting machinery and crumbling buildings. There, they found Tabby's car. Its door was flung open, lights still on, but it was empty. No signs of struggle, no signs of a sudden departure. Just a trail of her belongings leading towards a looming, abandoned warehouse. His father's words snapped him back to reality, a stern command to stay put. Jeremy watched as his father pulled a flashlight from the glove box, the beam of light his only tool. And then he was gone, swallowed up by the black maw of the warehouse, leaving Jeremy alone in the car, the haunting melody of the music box playing once more in his mind. Jeremy sat in the car, as still as a 12-year-old boy could, with the rain drumming incessantly against the roof. His heart pounded in his chest, each thud echoing the seconds that stretched into minutes, minutes that felt like an eternity. He fiddled with the radio, turning the dial sporadically, the drone of the static interspersed with fragments of songs and the occasional news report. He was trying to distract himself from the fear that was creeping through his muscles, but the emptiness of the car was a harsh reminder of his father's absence. After what felt like an hour, but had only been about 15 minutes, Jeremy decided he could wait no longer. He steeled his nerves and drew in a confident breath. Drawing his hoodie over his head, he stepped out into the cold, relentless rain. He squinted, trying to make out the shape of the warehouse in the darkness. Taking a deep breath, he began to move towards the ominous silhouette of the building, his small sneakers sloshing through the rain-soaked pavement. The warehouse was even darker inside than it had seemed from the outside. The only light came from a single beam of moonlight that filtered in through a broken window high above. As Jeremy stepped over the threshold, a horrifying sound hit his ears, the sound of his father sobbing. It was a sound he had never heard before, one that sent chills down his spine and made his heart beat even faster. As he moved closer, the beam of moonlight illuminated a scene that would forever be etched in Jeremy's mind. Blood and viscera were scattered across the floor, intermingled with the torn clothing that Tabby had last been seen wearing. The sight was gruesome, too brutal for a boy of his age to fully comprehend. In the midst of it all, lying amongst the chaos and carnage, was the music box. Jeremy's father looked up at him, a vacant expression in his eyes that left him petrified. It was as if every bit of life, every ounce of spirit, had been drained from him. Jeremy had never seen his father like this, had never imagined he could look so lost, so broken. After what seemed like an eternity, flashing lights and sirens cut through the somber silence. The police had arrived, responding to the call Jeremy had made using his father's cell phone. Officers swarmed the scene, their stern faces softening as they took in the sight of the young boy, cold and shivering, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. One of the officers wrapped his thick jacket around Jeremy's shoulders, a small act of kindness that made the boy's lower lip tremble. They guided him away from the gruesome scene, taking him back to the squad car where they asked him a series of questions. His responses were monosyllabic, his mind still struggling to comprehend the night's events. Back at home, Jeremy heard his father on the phone with his employer, his voice barely audible as he explained that he would be taking some time off. The house felt different, colder somehow, even though nothing had physically changed. The music box sat ominously on the dinner table, its once shiny surface marred by speckles of his mother's blood. Unable to bear the sight, Jeremy retreated to his room, burying his face in his pillow as he let the tears flow. His sobs were muffled by the fabric, a sad symphony of grief that played into the early hours of the morning. Exhausted, he eventually fell into a fitful sleep, his dreams haunted by the melody of the music box and the pained screams of his father echoing from the next room. His sleep was anything but peaceful, filled with distorted images of his mother and the terrifying sounds of his father's desperate cries. The music box's melody was omnipresent, a haunting soundtrack that underpinned his nightmares. The night was long, and sleep brought no relief from the reality of their loss. Afternoon sun pierced his shades, he was awakened by the light filtering through his eyelids. After rubbing the sleep out of his eyes and stretching, he realized what time it was. His father would have woken him up by now for breakfast, he thought. Jeremy, feeling the emptiness of the house, began to look for his father. Each room he checked was silent and vacant, another reminder of the absence of life. He surmised his father was probably at the police station, dealing with the aftermath of the previous night's tragedy. His attention swiftly turned to the music box. It was no longer on his desk, where he had last seen it. Moments later, the all-too-familiar melody wafted through the air, beckoning him like a piper. As he left his room and ventured down the hallway, he noticed a peculiar change in the atmosphere. The normally warm colors of their home began to transition into a bluish-green hue. It was as if he had stepped into a different world, one that was centuries older than the reality he knew. By the time he reached the staircase, the transformation was complete. The once familiar surroundings now looked decrepit and desolate, as if the house had aged hundreds of years in mere moments. The walls were peeling, the ceiling sagged, and the staircase creaked ominously under his weight. Taking a step onto the staircase, Jeremy's foot plunged through a rotten board. He tumbled down, landing hard on the cold, damp basement floor. Pain shot through his ankle, a clear indication of a bad break. The fall, unexpected and painful, left him breathless, his heart pounding in his chest. He called out for his father, his voice echoing in the empty house. But there was no response, just the ominous silence that had settled in their home. The lingering melody of the music box seemed to mock his calls, with a taunting chime. The house felt devoid of life, as if it had slipped out of the normal flow of time. Jeremy lay on the basement floor, alone and injured, surrounded by a house that no longer felt like home. His cries reverberated through the desolate structure. Lying on his back, Jeremy looked up through the hole in the floor above him, the painful throbbing of his broken ankle providing another predicament. His mind raced, trying to conceive a plan to escape the basement with his injury. He winced, his breath hitching with each pulse of pain that coursed through his body. In the midst of his thoughts, the music box fell through the hole, landing in the patch of light that streamed through the gap. It looked as sinister as ever, the haunting melody it emitted seeming to grow louder, reverberating with a vile resonance in the confined space. Driven by fear and frustration, Jeremy crawled over to the fallen relic. He grunted, each movement sending fresh waves of pain up his leg. Once within reach, he grabbed a piece of fallen plumbing pipe from the pile of debris and began to relentlessly strike the music box. With each hit, the melody grew louder, as if in direct defiance of his actions. It filled the room, enveloping him in its haunting tune, permeating the air around him until there was nothing else. It was as if the entire world had been swallowed by the melody, the discordant notes echoing within his skull. Exhausted, Jeremy could hit no more. He dropped the pipe, clutching his ears in a vain attempt to block out the relentless tune. In a final act of desperation, he screamed, "Stop!" And to his surprise, it did. The universe fell silent. The green hue that had colored his world faded, replaced by the familiar tones he was used to. The music box sat mute and seemingly harmless on the basement floor, its melody silenced. But the hole in the floor remained, a grim proof of the surreal events. And his ankle throbbed with a persistent reminder of his reality. Jeremy's hands, sore and grimy, clawed at the splintered edges of the basement stairs. His injured ankle throbbed painfully with each jolting movement. He drew a shuddering breath, steeling himself for the climb. With a grunt of effort, he hoisted himself up onto the first step, wincing as a splinter burrowed into his palm. The stairwell was an exercise in agony. Each step was a mountain, every breath a gale-force wind threatening to topple him. He grappled with the jagged wood, his fingers slipping on the shards of what was once a robust staircase. Finally, he reached the gap. For a moment, he hesitated, perched precariously on the precipice. His heart pounded in his chest, his ribs aching with each beat. But then, he swallowed his fear, steeled his resolve, and rose to his feet, his body swaying unsteadily. With a guttural roar, Jeremy launched himself across the gap. His fingers scraped against the cold linoleum of the kitchen floor, his grip slipping. Panic flared in his chest as he slid back towards the edge, but he forced his palm flat against the floor, his fingers webbing gripping the linoleum. With a final, desperate heave, he hauled himself to safety, just as the remaining stairs collapsed with a thunderous crash into the basement below. His chest heaved as he lay sprawled on the kitchen floor, his body screaming in protest. But he didn't have time to rest. The haunting melody of the music box drifted to his ears, a sinister lullaby that seemed to mock his struggle. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the devastation. His once cozy home now looked like the aftermath of a tornado, furniture upturned and personal belongings scattered like confetti. With a grunt, Jeremy pushed himself to his feet, limping through the wreckage in search of a weapon. He found a broken table leg, its jagged edge providing a crude but effective tool. He pressed his back against the cold wall of the living room, gripping the makeshift weapon until his knuckles turned white. "I've had enough of your games," he growled, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Why are you tormenting me? What do you want?" As if in response, the music box's melody intensified, the notes swirling around him like a chilling wind. Suddenly, a loud splintering echoed through the room, the sound akin to the breaking of bones. His eyes shot towards the noise, watching in horror as the plaster wall before him began to crack, the fissures spreading like a deadly spider's web. The white powder of the drywall spilled onto the floor, followed by chunks of the plaster, each one landing with a dry thwack. Then the wood beneath began to bulge outwards, heaving in a rhythm that was hauntingly similar to breathing. The boards strained against the pressure until, with a loud snap, they gave way. A horrific, globular creature tumbled forth from the cavity, landing with a sickening, wet thud on the worn carpet. The creature, a pulsating mass of what looked like flesh, began to crawl towards him with a startling speed, its belly heaving against the floor. Fear gripped Jeremy, a primal terror that momentarily rooted him to the spot. The table leg slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the floor. Snapping out of his terror-induced paralysis, Jeremy turned and scrambled towards the back door, the creature in hot pursuit. The doorknob was cold beneath his sweaty palms, refusing to turn. He threw his shoulder against the door repeatedly, his heartbeat pounding loudly in his ears. Finally, the door gave way, sending him sprawling onto the dew-drenched grass outside. He scrambled up and, with a surge of adrenaline, slammed the door shut just as the creature lunged for him. The creature's momentum carried it forward, its bulk slamming into the door with an impact that almost shattered it. Jeremy stood frozen in his backyard, the chill of fear rooting him to the spot as the monster pounded against the door from the inside. He was trapped, the towering privacy fence presenting a formidable obstacle to his escape. His 12-year-old frame, short for his age, was ill-equipped to scale such heights. The melody of the music box filled the air, emanating from the windows of his home, which now seemed to blaze with an otherworldly energy. It was as if the house was no longer a physical entity, but a confluence of demonic forces, a terrible spectacle that held him in its thrall. Suddenly, his mind's eye was filled with a vision of the spiritual realm. It was as if a grid had been superimposed over the land, revealing the unseen energies that swirled and converged around his house. He could sense a weakness in the barrier of this realm, a thinning veil that separated his world from the unknown. Just as this realization dawned on him, the pounding stopped. The blue light streaming from the windows dimmed and the house fell eerily silent. Sensing a trap, Jeremy decided against venturing back inside. Instead, he moved towards the fence, placing his good foot on the lowest wooden outcrop and hoisting himself up. But as he strived for a foothold, a skeletal hand erupted from the ground, its bony fingers wrapping around his ankle. He screamed as he was yanked back, his breath stolen as he hit the ground. The door that the monster had been trying to break down now creaked open ominously. A long, serpentine limb shot out from the darkness within, reaching across the yard to wrap around Jeremy's other leg. He clawed at the grass as he was slowly reeled in. The lawn was left with deep gouges where his fingers dug in. With a sound akin to a grotesque slurp, he was yanked into the house, the door slamming shut behind him with a resounding bang. The melody of the music box swelled, filling the house with its haunting refrain, a chilling prelude to the terror within. Consciousness returned to Jeremy in a rush, a tidal wave of awareness that slammed into him with a force that was almost physical in its intensity. His senses were immediately flooded with a bizarre cocktail of sensations that were both alien and terrifyingly familiar. He was not in his bed, not in his house, but somewhere far removed from both. The smell was atrocious, his eyes watering at the scent of rotting meat and crude oil. A consistent hum reverberated through the expanse, loud enough it rattled Jeremy's bones. Every inch of his body was in severe pain and every breath felt as if it were a cloud of fine glass. He was embedded in a fleshy membrane, a living, breathing cocoon of tissue that held him captive. His body was connected to a web-like network of flesh, a grotesque tapestry of sinew and muscle that ensnared him, holding him in place. He was not alone. Encased within similar columns of organic material, other souls writhed in torment. Their screams echoed in the air, a symphony of despair that chilled Jeremy to his very marrow. With a Herculean effort, Jeremy managed to tear his head free from its fleshy prison. He looked upwards, his gaze met with a sight that would have broken any human mind. The sky was a vast, unending sea of trapped souls, each one caught in their own private hell, their cries of agony adding to the chorus of the damned. As the membrane began to peel his flesh away, Jeremy screamed. The pain was indescribable, a fire that consumed every nerve ending, every fiber of his being. Each peel of the membrane intensified his agony, his shrieks joining the symphony of suffering that filled the air. Yet, amidst the chaos and the torment, a figure stood out. In the heart of this hellscape, a dancer moved with an eerie grace. A titan of a figure, towering over the damned like a porcelain antichrist. It was the same dancer from the music box, her silhouette unmistakable. But where her face should have been, there was only a void, a white surface of nothingness that was somehow more terrifying than any of the horrors that surrounded him. Then, that void began to rip, tearing open in a grotesque parody of a smile. Skin stretched from ear to ear, forming a mouth that was all teeth and darkness. She was now his porcelain goddess, the focal point of his new existence.